Welcome to the Reading Nook. So here in this little segment on my channel is the Reading Nook, where we are reading A Cat's Chance in Hell by Sharon Hannaford at this moment in time. So make sure you've got your drinks and you're good to go. Without choking on your drinks, of course. So I'm going to pop up some pictures of the canvases that we've worked on so far, and all details of current projects are in the comment section below. Big shout out to Sharon Hannaford. Thank you so much for giving me your permission to read this on my channel. It's been great fun, especially the accents. I'm so sorry. As you saw at the start as well, there's a warning. It's for mature audiences, so please, no kids. But other than that, I hope you enjoy. Bye!
Chapter 13. Gabby knew she'd been right earlier. The woman Gregory was talking about must have been the donor for Julius's dinner. While Gabby may have initially felt fear or revulsion when she realised what he'd been up to, now there was no horror, no distaste, only annoyance and an unfamiliar spark of jealousy. This wasn't something she'd anticipated, and she didn't know how to deal with it. "No," he addressed Gregory. "You could take her home now. We'll be fine." Gregory departed in a hurry, clearly pleased to be leaving the room. Alexander let out an amused chuckle. "Poor Gregory. You really are unkind to him, Julius." "I am?" Julius asked mildly. "In what way?" He moved to join them, leaning back against one of the pool tables facing the other men, but positioned himself where he could still see Gabby's face. She knew that to humans she had a very good poker face, but supernaturals were different. A vampire would detect every tiny twitch of muscles, the slightest tightening of her jaw, smallest change in dilation of her pupils, her breathing or her heartbeat. She schooled herself not to betray any of her internal disquiet. "You just brought the big scary boogie monster and her werewolf sidekick into his domain and told him they are to be protected at all costs." Alexander stopped chuckling long enough to take a sip of his bourbon. "He's going to walk out and kiss the sun one of these days, and then where will you be?" "You wouldn't dare," Julius disagreed shortly. "Hey," Carl said in an injured tone, "since when did I become the sidekick?" "Since your name isn't Angeli Morte," answered Alexander sardonically. "True," he conceded. "To Hellcat!" He raised his beer in her direction. "Boogie monster to vampires everywhere." "Hellcat," Alexander repeated. "I like that. It suits her better than Angeli Morte." "To Hellcat," he toasted as well, raising his glass and downing the rest of his whiskey. "Drunken idiots," Gabby muttered, picking up a handful of chocolate truffles and throwing them at Carl. He caught most of them and shoved them in his mouth, munching cheerfully before washing them down with beer. "Ugh!" Gabby pulled a revolted face at him. "I have a question," Gabby declared, looking pensively at Julius. "Only one?" "For now," she replied. "Will you answer me honestly?" "As honestly as I can." "Who's your informant in the society?" "Ah," he said, apparently taken quite by surprise by the sudden change in subject. He paused, deliberating his answer. "I'm afraid I need your assurance that punitive action will not be taken before I divulge that information. We can't allow the people close to us to betray our trust in them without some kind of disciplinary action. What if the same person is also supplying information to other sources, like Dancy, for example?" "I understand your viewpoint, but I'm afraid I'm not telling you anything unless I know they won't be harmed." Julius was unmoving. "Harmed?" she exclaimed, shocked. "We'd never hurt anybody for being an informant. They'd probably be dismissed unless there were extreme extenuating circumstances. Perhaps told to leave the city, have their memories erased, but never harmed." She was slightly offended at the thought. "Anyway, I don't have the power to make that decision. It would be in the council's hands." Julius moved to the bar counter, swept up the bottle of wine, and returned, quickly filling Gabby's glass before his own, going back to his position against the pool table. It was obviously a delay tactic while he mulled the question over. "First, answer a question of mine," he said finally. "Why not answer mine first?" "I'm afraid we'll get sidetracked once I answer yours. My question is weighing heavily on my mind." Gabby sighed and rolled her eyes, in annoyance getting the better of her self-control. "Well then, by all means, get it off your chest, Jules." She had a feeling she knew what was coming. "Why didn't you tell me the truth about what the wraith did to you?" "You never actually asked me what it did to me," she replied calmly, but even she could hear the slight defensiveness in her tone. That's because you conveniently forgot to tell me that you actually engaged it during a fight, he said, a muscle in his jaw twitching. Well, no one knew what the damn thing was capable of. It just seemed like another form of demon. I figured next would do some kind of damage. She was outright defensive now. And what happened when you attacked it? He asked brusquely. Gabby chewed her bottom lip, trying to think of a way to put it that didn't sound as bad as it seemed at the time. She noticed Carl close his eyes, apparently reliving the memory, and he gave a quick shudder. It threw her 30 feet across the ground without so much as lifting an arm, Carl recalled somberly. She was aiming for its eyes, and all it did was flick its head at her. Gabby glared at him, warning him to shut it. Julius hadn't taken those deep blue eyes off her, even though Carl was speaking. She shifted uncomfortably under the dark accusation. Didn't really do anything to me. It was just like I'd touched an electric current, or a force field of some kind. It threw me backwards, and... She looked down, pulling a thread on her sleeve, and then continued in a rush. When I managed to catch my breath from the fall, I realised I couldn't see anything. Like I was in thick fog in the pitch dark. The twitching of the muscle in Julius's jaw grew more pronounced. And that was it. The Magi banished it, and my sight was back in the following day. And you didn't think this was relevant to bring up after the Wraith's appearance at the train station last night? Well, you were already freaking out about your vision. You didn't need any more reasons to try and keep me away from the fight. She was back to sounding annoyed. Annoyed was good. Better than defensive, she decided. How many days ago was this? He asked. I think I've lost track, she frowned, drawing her eyebrows together in concentration. Oh yes, now I remember. It was the night before you kidnapped me, she recalled dryly. So your sight was back to normal in the morning? More or less, she replied wearily, a slight edge in her voice. I'm sorry, he said, surprising her completely. I wouldn't have blindfolded you if I'd known. There was genuine regret in his tone. The Wraith also said that you thwarted Dante's attempted assassination, but it obviously wasn't classing its own attack on you as deadly. So what other attempt has been made on your life? Gabby cocked her head and stared at him, her eyes narrowed in confusion. She hadn't actually given that part of the Wraith's speech much thought, with everything else that was going on. She shook her head, mystified. I can't think of anything that would qualify as an assassination attempt, she said slowly, trying to remember the exact words the Wraith had used. And you, Wolf? Julius turned his attention to Carl. Can you think of anything? Carl's expression turned thoughtful. He was chewing the inside of his cheek. Well, I honestly have no recall of the conversation you guys had with the Wraith. Are you sure it wasn't talking about the time it sent Gabby flying? Yes, well, you were suffering a severe concussion at the time, Julius said. No, the Wraith said it was under different orders when it encountered Gabby at a previous battle. Yes, and Alexander interjected now. It also said something about its master's other pets, as though they were the ones who had failed. It implied earlier that it had been toying with the two of you instead of trying to kill you, but that Dante would fix that situation soon. He spoke of a Dark One, who I'm going to guess is the Dark Magus, who seemed to have some arcane knowledge of your and Gabby's involvement in all this. Oh, replied Carl, even though he seemed shaken for it. Well, he trailed off. For once unable to put a positive spin on what had transpired. Gabby snorted. Yes, all doom and gloom and prophecies reminded me scarily of Athena. She rolled her eyes theatrically at the name. We even had special names. I was a human who's not a human, and apparently you are the wolf who's not a wolf, she said dramatically, emphasizing the names with a deep rasp, trying to intimidate the Wraith when she chuckled darkly. Very original. Her eyes snapped to Julius. That reminds me. Why did the Wraith call you the Baron? She asked, putting little air quotes around the title and popping a pastry into her mouth. Julius sighed. Because, he ground out between his teeth, that was my title when I was a human. Now, we were trying to work out the assassination attempt that had been made on Gabby's life. Any ideas, anyone? He continued, promptly changing the subject. Gabby filed that little snippet of information away for future questioning. Have there been any close calls in the past few weeks? Anything that could be work-related or during personal time? Any odd occurrences? Julius prodded. Gabby still looked baffled and looked over at Carl. I can't think of anything out of the ordinary. Can you? Nope, aside from the previous 2 fights, which the Wraith apparently not referring to, things have seemed relatively normal, he mused thoughtfully. The only other odd occurrence is you being attacked by... He trailed off, glancing quickly at Julius, then back at her. You know, the bunch who was supposed to take you to Julius? Understanding dawned on her face. Julius and Alexander both went rigid. No offence, I wasn't trying to imply anything, Carl said quickly, seeing their intense reactions. It was just an observation. The 2 vampires looked hard at each other as they were conversing without words. Julius's eyes were burning with anger and trepidation. Alexander recovered first. It's possible? He almost whispered, his jaw clenched, but his face carefully blank. We spoke about it, and things didn't add up at the time, but it just seemed like one of Genevieve's bizarre moods. She was too old for the red rage. Volatile, yes, but to attack over a small insult? It was extreme even for Genevieve. Julius shook his head, not in denial, but rather in disbelief. Do you think both of them? Julius asked in a voice tight with rage. Alexander looked off out into the garden, his eyes distant, not seeing what was actually in front of him. Eventually he nodded, a single quick bob of his head. Yes, I don't see Genevieve keeping something like that from him. You know he was the only one who was so adamant. They both went on this mission, so it seems to fit. Is there any way we could be sure, though? We must investigate this further. If it's true, there may be others. Julius looked as though someone had punched him in the gut, as though his world had just been upended. Gabby looked across at Carl to see if he was making any sense of the conversation, but he looked just as confused as she felt. Yes, Alexander responded shortly. Do you think Sebastian can help? He might be able to trace their movements, their correspondence, any outside contacts. Can he be trusted, do you think? Julius sounded uncertain for the first time since Gabby had encountered him. Maybe this will be a good test. If you order him to find the information, he will have no choice but to obey. His findings could be very telling. Alexander had settled into a cold, hard rage. Call him. Tell him to meet us in my office in half an hour. Julius ordered briskly. Alexander left the room in a rush of air. Gabby's head was spinning. A few moments ago she was about to find out who had been leaking information to Julius about the SMV. Now the two vampires had gone off on a tangent about the assassination attempt on her life, which she hadn't even known about until Julius brought it out. She wasn't sure how she felt about that little fact either. Grateful to be alive? Annoyed at the attempt? That the vampires were blowing it all out of proportion? She needed to slow everything down and let her brain catch up. What did Alexander and Julius mean by Genevieve, and who was Sebastian? Too many questions and not enough answers. Julius, Gabby snapped, are you going to tell us what's going on, or am I going to have to beat it out of somebody? Julius pursed his luscious lips. Well, we can't be positive at this stage, but we think perhaps we have traitors in our ranks, he said calmly and clearly, but the clipped tone he used spoke volumes about his feeling on the subject. The way that Genevieve attacked you on Friday has not sat well with me. Never made any sense. Genevieve has never had the most even temper, but for her to attack you like that, completely against orders, was not normal. Not even by volatile vampire standards. Alexander and I had discussed the subject before, and we wondered if there was more to it than a simple temper. He paused for a moment, as though he needed to steel himself for his next words. We're wondering if they're working for Dante, and if they were, are there any others in my clan that are doing the same? Alexander walked back into the room and went straight to the bar to refill his glass. In the silence, Gabby could hear the clink of ice falling into the crystal tumbler and the splash of alcohol over it. It was Carl who broke the ensuing silence. But why would Dante want Gabby taken out of the picture? How does he even know of her existence? He demanded. It doesn't make any sense. The other three looked at each other, Gabby gnawing the inside of her lip again. Carl had been too concussed to remember the Wraith waxing lyrical about the prophecies made by the Dark Mage. He didn't know that Mariska had foreseen Gabby and him as pivotal players in the upcoming war, players that Dante needed to control or eliminate if he wanted the upper hand. Alexander walked over with another beer for Carl and explained in short clipped sentences that what the Wraith had said, while Gabby and Julia stared at each other, pensive frustration on both their faces. Minutes later, Julius led them out of the entertainment area, up a sweeping flight of stairs to the first story, and along a short corridor to his office. As the door opened, Gabby remembered her first visit to the room. It was as large and comfortable as she remembered it. The computer still hummed quietly on one side of his desk, and she again felt the strange sensation of trying to melt her idea of a vampire lair with his office, which was so obviously belonged to a businessman who made full use of all available technology and gadgetry. She noticed so much more as she stepped through the door this time. Walking in with full control of her own faculties, and not feeling threatened or unsure of her immediate future, she took the time to admire the smaller details. There were some beautiful watercolours on the walls, a few Greek and Roman artefacts, and a shelf on the massive bookshelf behind the desk dedicated to old books, which would probably prove to be first editions. There was a shadowed alcove in the back corner of the room, which she was sure had been vacant the last time she was in here. It was taken up now by a large, strategically lit display case full of ancient weapons. Gabby was mesmerised. Weapons were one of her favourite things in the world. Aside from necks, she'd started a collection of her own, but nothing to rival this exhibit. She knew why the case hadn't been in here the last time she was a guest in this office. She would definitely have found a way to get her hands on a few of them. Julius was a smart vampire. She glanced away from the display to see him watching her with a little smile playing at the corners of his mouth, his thoughts obviously echoing her own. "Please make yourself comfortable." He indicated the chaise lounge Gabby had woken up in, and another against the window wall. Alexander had taken one of the two guest office chairs, and Julius settled himself in the chair behind his desk. The other guest chair sat waiting for the unfortunate Sebastian. Gabby continued her investigation of the room, browsing the book collection. She still had too much nervous energy to sit still. She didn't turn from her perusal of the books as she said, "I've answered your question. Now it's your turn." She heard Julius snort softly. Apparently he was under the assumption she'd forgotten all about the question amid all the new developments. She turned her attention to him now, leaning back against the bookshelf and resting her left hand on her hip. She would have folded her arms to look more stern if it still didn't hurt to do that. "All right, fair enough," he conceded. "But you have to understand that much of the information we have on you came from Sebastian, whom you're about to meet. Sebastian has no ties to the S&V, and he is a computer whiz who used all kinds of geeky computer tricks to find out things about you. You need to trust me when I say that my informant didn't give me very much information at all." Gabby sighed. "Informants?" she asked sharply, emphasizing the S. "There's more than one?" Julius nodded. "And I ask that you entreat the council to send them to me if they decide to dismiss them. I have places for them in my own staff. They won't cause you any harm, I assure you of that. Neither of them would have given me any information if they weren't completely convinced that I had no intention of harming you or anyone else in the organization. They were under Alpha's orders." This meant that they were werewolves, and their Alpha was under Julius's orders, Gabby realised, once again intrigued by supernatural politics. "Just spit out their names, and we'll take it from there." "Ross and Rory. They gave me the information that you were close to one of the council members and told me when you had a night off. They were to help me make contact with you." Carl sat up in surprise. "Ross and Rory, the werewolves? Team drivers?" he asked, shocked. Julius nodded. "They're part of the Black River Pack, and the Alpha of the Black River Pack works for me." Byron would have looked into that kind of link. He would have checked on their Alpha before bringing them into the society, Carl protested. "Ah," Julius responded dryly. "But their Alpha doesn't genuinely work as head of security officer at Fleming's Gentlemen's Club. Flamingo's just happens to be owned by one of my holding companies." Further discussion on the matter was brought to an end as they all heard a set of quiet footsteps approaching the office. "Come in, Sebastian," Julius called when the footsteps hesitated near the door. Gabby took a seat next to Carl as a tall, gawkish young man entered the office. It took a few seconds before Gabby realised that the freckled, ginger-haired individual was actually a vampire. His vampire presence was so weak as to be almost non-existent, and he moved with none of the fluid, confident grace of the rest of Julius's retinue. "Sire?" he greeted, almost tripping over his feet on his way to bow jerkily in front of Julius's desk. "Alexander asked me to come to you urgently?" He kept his eyes down except for a brief worried glance at Alexander. Gabby wasn't sure he was even aware of Carl and her being in the room. Extremely unusual behaviour for a vampire. "Yes, Sebastian, I need you to find some information for me. It is of a very important and sensitive nature. I know if anyone can do it, you can." Julius spoke with a carefully toneless but utterly authoritative voice. Gabby felt the slight wisp of power brush against her as it quickly filled the room and swirled around the geeky young vampire. Sebastian nodded with a quick, erratic bob of his head. Of course, sir. Anything I could do would help. Anything at all. Gabby had the feeling that if vampires could sweat, this one would be lathered like a nervous horse. It was strangely unsettling to see another vampire having this kind of reaction to Julius. It reminded her once again of exactly how powerful Julius was, precisely what different worlds they lived in. It brought back the memory of Julius's dinner guest, and she barely suppressed a shudder. Julius rose from his chair and inclined his head towards Carl and her on the couch. Sebastian actually flinched when he noticed the two of them, apparently for the first time. Gabby wondered if Sebastian was just a really new vampire, or if something had actually gone wrong during his turning. She'd never encountered such a feeble, nervous, inept vampire before. She guessed that out on the streets, without the protection of someone like Julius, he would have simply been fodder to other vampires. I would like you to meet Gabrielle Bradford and Carl Robson, Julius said formally. I'm sure you recognise them from your surveillance footage. The gawky young vampire swallowed convulsively, and his eyes grew huge and panicky. He looked quickly from the two of them back to Julius with a pleading look on his face. He seemed utterly incapable of getting any words out. Alexander actually started sniggering from his chair, and Julius's expression suddenly became one of annoyed exacerbation. Then he spoke slowly and clearly, as though explaining something of significance to a 3-year-old. I'm not giving you to them, Sebastian. They didn't come here looking for revenge or retribution. The ginger-haired vampire's anxiety levels immediately went down a notch, but he still held a frightened, apprehensive look in his eyes. Something has come to our attention, and we need you to verify or disprove a theory. You are the most competent clan member for this kind of investigation. Suddenly, Julius's voice took on a strange authoritative quality again, and whispers of power teased the hairs on Gabby's arms upright. What we are about to reveal to you is not to leave this room, and is not to be discussed with anyone besides the 5 people present here. Do you understand me, Sebastian? No one. Yes, of course, sir. I completely understand. You can count on me. Of course, anything I can help with. Anything at all, he stammered quickly. Good, Julius said shortly. His voice returned to normal, and the power level in the room subsided. Alexander will explain the situation and our requirements to you, while I see to our guests. A millisecond later, he was in front of Gabby with his arms extended in invitation. Shall we? He invited, slightly mockingly. Gabby ignored his arm, but stood and strode towards the door, casting a last analysing look at the young vampire, causing him to pull in a quick, nervous breath. Julius seemed to have problems hiding an amused smirk as he trailed behind her out the door. Carl loped out after them, giving Alexander a quick farewell salute. 10 minutes later, Gabby and Carl were in the Mustang on the way home. Gabby had wanted to stay and find out if Sebastian turned up anything, but Carl had pointed out that he had hardly had any sleep in the last few days, and he was on duty the following day. Gabby had a feeling that he was only saying it to get her home and to rest, but she couldn't really argue with the sentiment. She was practically asleep on her feet. It was nearly 3 a.m. Monday morning, and even though she was officially off hunter duty, she was bound to have some conventional work for today. So they reluctantly left the estate with Julius's assurance that he would let them know the moment he had any worthwhile information to share. Thanks for joining me this week. See you next time. Bye.